Thank you, Dubeji. I'm sorry, Sushil Jainji, track habit. Today, I would like to talk about disorder, but it may be at levels that we don't see eye to eye. So I will definitely invite some criticism at the end of this talk so that we can have an active dialogue. In many religions in the world, the tree is used as a symbol of life. And in the Indian tradition, both the Bhagavad Gita and the Katha Upanishad, they talk about the tree of life, the inverted tree of life, with its roots in heaven and the branches emanating into our world. But on any piece of ground, it's not only one tree that grows. Other shrubs and trees also grow from the same ground. And today I would like to talk about a very thorny shrub which grows from the same ground, which I'm calling the shrub of disorder. But to connect it to the botanical world, we could take the example of the bougainvillea. It's a very common ornamental plant these days, and it has very, very appropriate and relevant similarities to our human individuality. Bougainvillea is primarily an ornamental plant. It has no major utility in the world. It's a climber. It cannot stand on its own. It has to climb on something for support. And it's a very insidious spreader. It climbs and then it spreads rapidly and takes over even the plant upon which it climbs. It has thorns that prevent animals from eating its leaves, and it does not offer any edible fruit to anyone. Quite similar to the human being. But the point to note is that both the bougainvillea as well as the traditional tree of life, which is the aswatha, the people tree, both have their roots in the same source, that energy which is beyond the mind. So both originate from the same, but the manifestation is very, very, very different. There is a simile here which is worth comparing to in our technological world. And that's the simile of an electric motor and a generator. An electric motor and a generator are identical pieces of equipment. They are not different. Essentially, it's a coil placed within a magnetic field. If you provide electricity to that coil, it rotates and it becomes a motor. If you rotate the shaft, it generates electricity from through the coils. Then it becomes a generator. So whenever you switch on a motor, the rotation of the shaft generates a current, and that's called the back EMF. And that's one of the biggest problems that engineers face. You never get the entire energy output from a motor because some of it becomes a back EMF which goes in the opposite direction to the current that is being supplied. So through technology, through all these 150 years, engineers have tried to address this problem of this back EMF. And they have come up with some solutions. And if you Google search and say, how do you reduce the back EMF of a motor? The answer you will get is by slowing down the motor. Put a load on the motor, slow it down, and the back EMF can be reduced, but it can't be eliminated. And if you look at our human living, we are doing precisely the opposite. We are speeding up our lives, resorting to multitasking, which is similar to taking off the load of the motor and allowing it to generate a higher and higher back EMF. And you see exactly that happening as our disorder from our lives interferes with day-to-day living. Now, there have been technological developments which have also contributed to reducing back EMF. They use electronics, semiconductors, diodes, different ways. But what they have realized is you can only reduce and manage this back EMF. You can't eliminate it. And it seems to me the human ego, which generates disorder, is in a similar state. You can minimize and reduce the effects of the ego, but you can't eliminate it. Because without the ego, there is no mind. Without the mind, there is no world that exists for us. So how do you go about reducing and managing this ego? Just as you reduce and manage a back EMF in the electric motor. Krishnamurti talked a lot about order in most of his talks, and he made statements like virtue is order, intelligence is order, love is order, beauty is order. And Krishnamurti also said, to have inside you that light that has no beginning and no ending, that is not lit by your desire, that is not yours or someone else's, when there is this inward light, whatever you do will always be right and true. It is only possible when you die to the past completely, and this can be done only when there is complete order in the brain. Now, we listen to all this, and there is absolutely no disagreement. We understand completely what is being said. But our intellect says, analyzes what we have heard, and then it says, what does order mean? And the common dictionary meaning of order is the arrangement of people or things according to a particular sequence or pattern. Now, sequence and pattern is a construct of our thought intellect. And therefore, inevitably, we assume that order is also something that is within the limits of thought intellect and can be created. And this is where Krishnamurti is misconstrued and misunderstood. Because again and again, what he's pointing out is order is not the opposite of disorder. The absence of disorder is order. Now, in a tree, the most visible part of it are the leaves. Then come the branches. After that comes the trunk. Now, we only infer that there is a root. We can't perceive the root. But seeing the tree standing there, logic says there must be something going under the ground supporting it. There must be something bringing water and nutrients from inside the soil. And therefore, we hypothesize and speculate that there is something called a root. When a tree dies, you can do a post-mortem and establish that there is a root. But while the tree is alive, you can only speculate and hypothesize that there is something called a root. So order is something that needs to be investigated in a similar manner. Looking at what is available, which is disorder, we have to investigate and hypothesize what is that order that exists from which even the disorder has arisen. But that order is not the opposite of disorder, and it doesn't fall within the construct of the mind. So, again, to go back to the example of the tree, the most visible part are the leaves. And the leaf has a primary function. It produces food for the plant as well as, you may say, every other living creature on this world. Because that food becomes the source of food for the insect, the animal, and up the food chain. If there were no trees, none of us would have any food. In a human society, leaves are represented by this entire gamut of activity for earning a livelihood. For a majority of human beings, earning a livelihood is the dominant activity in their lives. A very, very small percentage do not need to work for a livelihood. So they are not representative of the majority. So let's talk of the majority. Majority have to work for a livelihood for a major part of their lives. And this working, the preparation for this working in today's world starts from the age of 2, when the child is sent to a nursery or a preschool. And it goes on till the age of 65 or 70, when the human being can't work anymore. Now, day-to-day living is centered around this activity of livelihood, particularly in the Western industrialized culture and society, which we have now overwhelmingly adopted. For example, our working week and weekend are suited to the factory and the office. Our office hours and working hours are suited to the factory and the office. This was not always so. In the traditional system, before the industry started dominating things here, there was no such thing as a weekly holiday. The holiday would be fortnightly at the time of the new moon and the full moon. Amavasya and Paurnami were always holidays. And even today, in the smaller towns or smaller localities, you will notice this in the Marwadi shops. The Marwadi shops start open by 6:30 in the morning. And they stay open till 9:30, 10 at night, because they would like to get every single customer that they can get. Business is competitive and difficult. So they work very long hours and they work 7 days a week. There's no holiday. But on the Amavasya day, 1 day in a month, every Marwari shop in that locality will be closed. Now, why was this holiday given? It was not a rest and relaxation, the way we look at our weekends. The vision from which this system emanated said that human beings live within the cycle of the moon, the lunar cycle, and the energies of the moon increase and decrease in the waxing and waning phase. And at Amavasya and Paurnami, the new moon and the full moon, when the energy is most intense, that is the time to withdraw from activity and spend more on inward contemplation. So the life was not centered around livelihood, although livelihood dominated most of the living time. There was very consciously a holiday system built in where you spent time withdrawing and gathering your energy when it was at its peak in the environment. Today, in the cities, definitely Marwadi shops adopt the Sunday holiday too, just like anybody else. Now, leaves compete for sunlight, right? Because sunlight is an essential for them to produce food. And you will, if you observe the leaves of any tree, they arrange themselves, they twist and they turn so that sometime in the day they get sunlight. All the leaves do not get the full quantity of sunlight that they need, and therefore their production of food is never optimum. And that's why probably you have so many leaves on a tree. Human beings too are in a similar position. They have to compete for the resources of livelihood. Everyone cannot earn the optimum. Now, branches of a tree support the leaves and they act as pathways to bring nutrients and water to produce the food. In our human society, parents, family, education act as branches, support and pathways to earn a livelihood. to earn the capability to earn a livelihood. But does the role of parents, family, education end with simply providing the support to enter a career? Or does the primary responsibility of all these is to ensure how to obtain a quality of life while one is living? This seems to have been pushed aside today in today's world. So if you look at the modern careerist living, grandparents have been delegated this role of looking after the children because the parents don't have time, right? Parents have little time or leisure to spend with children, and particularly in the urban culture, there is very little time to even have a family meal, except probably on a Saturday or a Sunday. And with the world becoming connected through the net, now the working hours go into the night because you have to adapt to where your customer is. And if your customer is in the West, well, for him it is daytime. When it is nighttime for you, you have to work. So livelihood seems to have taken over everything else, and at a tremendous cost. So will all this increase disorder or will it reduce disorder? Now the branches in turn spring from the trunk of the tree, and they provide the entire superstructure for the tree to stand. In human living, isn't society the trunk of the tree which provides that structure? But then comes a very, very basic question. Is that society different from the individual? Or does the individual make the society? Just like every drop of water comes together and makes the ocean, is the drop separate from the ocean? So is the individual separate from society? We act as if it is. There's an age-old story which established the relationship between the individual and society. There's the story of a king who believed that his people were very religious, very generous, very dharmic. And one day the minister told him, well, you assume that. Why don't you put your assumption to a test? So the king said, good idea. And he gave an order. Tomorrow morning, everybody is to bring 1 lota of milk and pour it into the tank, common tank in the village. So king's order had to be obeyed. So the next morning, one chap got up very early and said, everybody is going to pour milk. So why don't I put a lota of water instead? Who's going to notice the difference? Right? So he brought in a lota of water and poured it into the tank. In the evening, when the minister had the tank opened, it had only water because everybody had thought the same. They thought they could bypass the requirement because others would obey. Right? And do we see how much our day-to-day living is in the same way? In common English, that's called one-upmanship. Can I be one up above the others? So what it only says is how every individual lives is going to be the society. So we can't ever say, this is the expectation of society. How can we not conform to it? When we say, I am society, how I am living makes for the society. I might be a minority. I might be one drop in the ocean, but I still add my worth to that society. So conforming to the expectations of society, is that not the trunk that supports this entire structure? If you do not conform to society, then it's a very, very painful process. You become an outcast, right? So society demands that conformity, and we have to learn how to live within that society and yet not conform. That's the greatest challenge that faces every human being. And the essence of that society, demand for conformity, rests upon just two pillars. Two. One is delegation, and the other is postponing and procrastinating. And this is what the nub of the talk today. And that's what I would really like to talk about. I am suggesting that these two, postponing and delegation, is the core of all disorder. Yes, of course, the core of the disorder is the ego itself, that we understand. But the ego is hidden from us. We can't see it. It first manifests itself in these two, delegation and postponing. So the roots of a tree have a very vital role to play. They support the tree, they provide the nutrients, but the roots can't be seen. They are only inferred. Only when the root is damaged do we understand that its functioning is essential to the tree. And in the city, you see it very easily. When they do this underground tunneling, sometimes they damage the root. And for no reason, the tree starts wilting and dying. Or the root hits a rock, stops growing. Then you understand that that root has not been able to grow, and therefore there's no sustenance for the tree. So if you look at any of these layouts, as they call them in all our cities, they get a piece of land which was once farmland, then develop it into plots, lay the roads, plant trees, because everybody says we must plant trees. So they plant the trees, and the tree grows for 10 or 15 years. Then construction starts in that layout. And after some time, the roads get paved. And then any piece of ground you start paving with concrete. So those trees don't have access to water anymore, the roots of those trees. And they stop growing. They can't grow any further. Once they fall, you can't replace that tree. And this is what we are seeing in Bangalore. It was once called a garden city. And we are fighting to preserve the trees which were planted 70 years ago when there was no concrete, there was no asphalted road. So they will live while they will live, but once they fall, they are gone. You can't replace them, except maybe with a concrete tree. So are not the roots of human beings similar? Their existence is inferred because we know that there has to be something which acts as the storehouse of this memory, the motive, provides all that, which is making us act, but we can't see it directly. Now that ego also arises from the same common source of energy, and energy cannot be seen. Energy cannot be perceived. Only the action of that energy in providing light, in providing heat, that we can sense. So we are dependent on our sense organs. Only what our sense organs can recognize, we say recognizes. We recognize. So our sense organs cannot detect magnetism. They cannot detect gravitation. They cannot detect nuclear energy. So we only assume they exist because of all the academic study that we. But if you just stand like that outside, you don't know that there is ultraviolet radiation in the sun. That's part of energy. So but in this simile, there are some significant differences between trees and humans too. And it's worth considering those differences. One, the plant itself competes for water and nutrients, just as the human being competes for resources. But plants do not isolate themselves in this competition. they are able to coexist with other plants. So you have 100 plants growing from a small patch of land, and whatever comes to that land goes to, whatever water comes to that land goes to all the plants. There's nobody grabbing for more. It's not possible. But we human beings, we put in our compound walls, we draw boundaries, we put our armies, we grab. So that is a very, very significant difference. So what is the source of this grabbing? It's the ego. It's insecurity, is it not? Human beings tend to move away from coexistence to individuality. And if you notice, our entire preparation for being a career is to become more and more and more individualistic. So, must increase disorder. So, what is a human being to do? Is there anything the human being can do? Because a human being can consciously only act from the act of the will, of the ego, which itself is the problem. So what is it the human being can do? Can a human being bring change into his daily living? And therefore, we can't address the root, the ego, because it's out of sight. So we can only address the next level, which is the trunk. And the trunk can be addressed by just looking at these two. No delegating, no postponing. Why do we delegate? Why do we postpone? Do we ask this question? Both delegation and postponing are acts of thought intellect. Naturally, there is no such thing as delegation and postponing, right? All planning, everything that we look at in our society comes from these two, intellect, and for that the intellect needs this act of delegation, it needs the act of postponing. Now, does this seem far-fetched? Let's just look at our human lifestyle and we see whether this is true or not. We are in the age of technological progress. The last 200 years, technology has made tremendous inroads. This entire technological progress rests on specialization. And this specialization is the essence of delegation. I focus only on this area, so somebody else has to do the other area. This is more important, so unimportant area can be done by somebody else. And therefore, it brings in this whole idea of superiority, a hierarchy of human beings, entirely invented by thought intellect and sustained by this delegation. And you see the consequences of this specialization. Our entire lifestyle, whether it is transportation, whether it is commerce, whether it is high-rise buildings, paved and concrete roads, electricity lines, wireless and mobile towers, motor vehicle pollution, invention of plastic, every one of these has come from this specialization through the delegation, and every one of them has created danger for our continued existence on this globe. So, delegation has its other side, which is I am separate from everybody else and I am superior to others. And therefore, I want to climb that ladder. If I am here, I would like to become something more important. So, both these, delegation and postponement, are as old as human beings. They are not a result of today's lifestyle. And you can see this in common day-to-day living. And it varies to some extent from culture to culture. So if you look at our Indian culture, cleaning up after a task is done is not part of our culture. That is to be delegated, right? Have you ever seen a craftsman, a tailor, a mason, barber, clean up after he does his work? No. That has to be done by the helper. Have you ever noticed that a bus driver or a lorry driver will never clean his vehicle? That is the cleaner's job. So there is a person called a cleaner, right? This is deeply ingrained. It's very, very difficult even to break this. Now, we are very, very enamored with Western culture, but we don't pick up this trait from the West, that they will not hesitate to do the clearing up after a task is done. That part we conveniently omit. And in fact, it's even more. If you watch people from India who go to the West, now when you go to the West, there is no maid servant, you have to do everything yourself. So they live there for 15 years, 20 years, right? Children are born there in that culture, learning to do all this by themselves. But if they return to India, something in the air here says, now I need to have a maid servant. I don't do this anymore. Now I delegate. It must be something in the air. So I'm suggesting this illness of delegation begins at home, and it begins very, very early in life. In how many homes do you have a culture that after a meal, everybody will wash their plates and then help in the clearing up of the table? Everybody, in many places, they just leave that and go. Either a maid has to do it, or a few years ago, if there was a daughter in the house, she had to do it. Right? The sons never did it. There are people who have never washed their plate in their lives. So, what about other household chores? You live in a house, it needs to be maintained, it needs to be cleaned. Whose responsibility is it? The mother or the sister. Or now they are also busy, well, maid servant. So that illness begins very early in life, and it begins in the home. So, and this illness is not identified with any particular socio-economic culture. It is across socio-economic culture, across all cultures in this land. This delegation, this thing that I don't clean, from every level of society, you will be able to see this, right? Now, when you study Gandhiji and some of the things that he did, right, in the seva of those days, one of the things that Gandhiji talked a lot about was cleaning toilets. Now, when we must understand that when Gandhiji said cleaning toilets, those toilets were not the kind of toilets we are used to today. These were toilets where human excrement had to be collected in buckets and taken out. It's unthinkable for us today. We can't think about it. But a whole generation of human beings did only that. And with the job went their dignity. Because we have delegated, we considered that job to be the worst job possible and delegated to those who had to do it. Right? So, even in our schools today, we are no more able to say, this is our home, and the cleanliness of the school will be maintained by the students and the teachers. If you try to do it today, you will have an uproar from parents. We are paying you fees and our children are supposed to act as cleaners? No, wait. So I pay this fee, I expect this in return. So we become service providers. Right? So fundamentally, postponing, putting off, and procrastination assumes that you will be alive later. Otherwise, how can you postpone? So the basic assumption, which is not talked about, is death is very far away, and therefore let us postpone. Kal karenge. Right? So what does it mean when Krishnamurti talks of living with death, inviting death into your life, into your living? And there's a very interesting passage, which is one of his old talks. And let me just read that. If you had only 1 hour to live, what would you do? Would you not arrange what is necessary outwardly, your affairs, your will, and so on? Would you not call your family and friends together and ask their forgiveness for the harm that you might have done to them, and forgive them for whatever harm they might have done to you? Would you not die completely to the things of the mind, to desires, and to the world? And if it can be done for an hour, then it can also be done for the days and the years that may remain. That is an extraordinary message to listen to, right? Because living with death implies no postponing and no delegation. Krishnamurti also pointed out at one point, if you want society to be something different, you have to start. You have to bring order to your house. The house is you, right? And I am suggesting bringing order to that house begins with no delegation, no postponing. You cannot delegate because you are the world. To whom will you delegate? And you cannot postpone because there is no tomorrow except in the imagination. So thought can be used to watch and be aware of this compulsion on the part of every one of us to delegate and postpone. And I think that is the key. Thank you.